All right. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction, and thanks for having us. Just as a disclaimer, as you said, I'm a happy camper in the field of economic history, and I'm typically mostly concerned with the economic history of Germany in the 18th and 19th century. So I'm by no means an expert on ancient history, or let alone Rome. So I brought in Allard Mees as reinforcement, and he will help out um, with all the concerns that you might have about ancient history and data concerns, etc. So he will step in during the talk from time to time and tell you a little more, not just on the specific project that I'm presenting here, but also more general about the data set that he's collating in Mainz. I'm also not an expert on networks, to be honest. So I'm working a bit on physical network infrastructure, and I've been recently also become more interested in social networks. But yeah, what you're going to see here is maybe not exactly what you're used to seeing in this talk. So the paper that I'm presenting today is joint work with, as you said, with Matthias Flückinger in York, Mario Larch in Bayreuth, Markus Ludwig in Braunschweig. At some point, some of us were together in Braunschweig, and this is where we started this project, which is now forthcoming in one of the top economics journals. And so I want to start out with a bit of motivation. So in the 30 minutes that we have, I will focus on not all of this, but at least I want to tell you a bit about what the paper is doing, and then kind of focus on a couple of things that might be interesting to you. So we started out this project with kind of the idea that that the data that Allard has, the terra sigillata data, which is Roman ceramics that he collated in his database, would be very interesting to look at in order to understand better ancient trade patterns. So we are really interested in how the transport network that was created during Roman times, when like Rome on its height was heavily integrated, really affected the trade patterns in the ancient world. And this is a question that, according to my understanding, was not really settled in the literature, because it was often claimed that it was not really a market economy, and there was kind of command patterns, or the military was organizing trade as much as possible, and we don't see the typical demand and supply patterns that we would expect in a modern economy. So this is our starting point, and then because we're really interested in path dependency, we also got interested in the long run patterns of this transport network. So we later on in this project started to look into whether the trade patterns that we saw in Rome are also persistent in that they affect socioeconomic exchange within Europe as of today. So we look into business links in modern day data. And then we kind of, in order to understand this persistency, we continue to go into kind of trying to understand about the mechanisms through which this persistency arises. And we looked into social integration, but also network integration in the periods in between. So just to clarify what we're doing, we're going to look at the question, or we analyze whether the trade patterns that we observe in ancient times, but also today, reflect market decisions. And these market decisions are basically reflected in transport costs. So the question, do transport costs actually affect the patterns of trade in ancient Rome, but also today? So what we do for this, so this is the full overview of what we're doing in the paper, and I'm just going to briefly walk you through this before just focusing on the first two parts of this, because this is all we can do today, and I think this is also what you're mostly interested in. So what we do in the paper is, or for the project, first of all, is we're going to create a Roman transport system. So basically, this is our physical network that allows us to calculate least cost paths between any region within the Roman Empire that we're focusing on. So we kind of trying to figure out how much does it cost to go from one region to another, given the different modes of transportation that we have at hand. And this is what we're going to later on call effective distance. And then we're going to use the data on Roman ceramics, the terra sigillata, in order to estimate an elasticity of Roman trade, meaning that we're going to estimate whether change in the distance will affect the volume of trade. And this elasticity is, we estimate it at approximately 2.1, meaning if you go 1% further away, trade will decline by 2%. That's roughly the interpretation of what we're doing. And this tells us something about whether market forces are at work in the ancient Roman trade system. And then in the paper, we do a lot of other things. We also show that the same exact effective distances, so the connectivity pattern that we see in the year around the height of the Roman Empire, also affected economic exchange in the medieval and early modern periods, so in the 13th to 18th century. We show that it affects today's economic integration, even though that in the meantime we had considerable changes in transport technologies, think of railroads and airplanes, that should actually kind of reset the entire transport system, which we show it doesn't. So the same patterns affect persistently economic exchange today. We do a couple of things that economists are worried about related to causality. So we need to confirm that this is indeed Roman specific transport costs and not reflecting overall geographic patterns that affect transport costs in general. So we do a lot of checks to make sure that this is really about the Roman transport network. And then we show a couple of mechanisms of integration for this persistence. So we show that regions that were better connected in Roman times are still better connected today. They have more cultural similarity, and they have stronger social networks, which we look into when we use Facebook data. So this explains a lot of this persistence, and these are things that I'm actually not going to talk about today. If you're still interested in these types of things, there's a fully blown version of my talk in the quantitative history webinar, and if you go to YouTube, you can find that or look at this link here. So let me start off. So what are we doing? We're starting out with a description of the data that we're using, which is the Roman goods trade. To kind of really briefly sum up the history, I would say that it is actually the first time in human history that we have significant interregional trade in Europe during the Roman period. Beforehand, there's certainly trade. There's certainly trade between and among tribes, but it doesn't have the extent that it achieves through Roman times. So there's now a large integrated entity, political entity for the first time that is connected via a huge transport network, which is what we're going to focus on, but has several other things, like a common currency. It has a common legal system. There's peace, and there's suppression of piracy in the Mediterranean. They have new other technologies that help them trade. So all of this is facilitating trade and integration. And of these, we're going to focus just on the fact, and what we're interested in, we're going to be focusing on this transport network. And we want to understand whether the creation of this new connected transport network facilitated trade. And since trade is hard to measure today and historically, we're just going to focus on one aspect of trade, because there's a traded good that is survived the hands of time, namely Roman ceramics, or specifically the terra sigillata that we're going to talk about a bit in a few seconds. So there's massive trade in these ceramics. According to my understanding, it's roughly 10% of the total volume of trade is in the ceramics, and it's traded throughout the Roman Empire. So I'm going to give the kind of the word to Allard here and talk a bit more about the data that he has at hand. Just to introduce it real quick, we have this huge database at the Romano-Germanic Central Museum in Mainz that he collated, and there's information about 250,000 vessels, which was dug up in about 4,000 archaeological sites. But you know much more about this, and you can tell much better what the data is about.
Yeah, thank you, Erik. Can you just show the next slide?
Yes.
Right. So what it actually shows, the data set, that it's the Roman Empire was just covered with a thick layer of ceramics, so the Roman porcelain it was. We only show here the incidences, not the frequencies, because this then you don't see anything anymore on the map. On the bottom right side, you see actually the regions of production, as we call it in archaeology. So the whole thing started in the 1st century BC from -30 onwards, the yellow ones, the Italian production sites, and this chronologically moved up into southern France, the red dots, where there is a large region there where they started producing the same kind of ceramics, and this slowly moved northwards through central Gaul up to into the Germanic provinces. Then we're talking about the 2nd century. So there is a sort of following the markets principle, but at the same time, as you can see in Spain, there's also a pretty large bunch of production sites which were more or less exclusively serving the Iberian market there. So it's all kind of dynamics underneath this plain map with roughly 4,000 dots. The next one. So what we actually do is we have this database in mind, but most important of this kind of projects is the creating of a research community. So what we do is we organize workshops in all different places in Europe where we train the people to enter their data. And this is done in a very liberal, collaborative way. It's based on the win-win principle that if I have material from a certain site and I want to hang my material into the European context of the Samian industry, I have to enter my data in a very kosher way. Otherwise, I can't run off the tools, which analysis tools, which the system provides as well. So dating curves, distribution maps, and so on. So now it is nearly 10 years already that we do this kind of European circus of workshops. And still until today, we haven't been forced to throw out any archaeologist who was doing nonsense. So it's really a sort of win-win situation. And of course, we in Mainz, we basically focus on further developing the system, but we don't interfere actually in how, well, in a certain way, how people are, what people are entering there. So during Christmas holidays, about 1,500 stems were added from French colleagues. So I was quite surprised coming back from my Christmas holiday. It is a collaborative project. So next one, please. It is in principle open access. So we offer VFS for which, so you can drag the stuff into your local QGIS. There is now, since recently, a Wikidata Sparkle interface. There is a GitHub resource. It's linked open data, a archaeology.link website, and there's also a RESTful API. We do this all under a so-called DTPL license, which basically says you can do with it for your, all what you want for your analyzer, but we do not really like that you would open up the same database, let's say on a server in Madrid, and start changing the potter names. And because the user community which is involved here is still not very large. You talk about maybe 50, 60 power users who are using it. But that is another phenomenon that this project is so successful because they're working on one resource. In the coin world, there are different resources, sort of competitive structures. And our idea is that we are not big enough to run multiple instances in different versions of these kind of resources. The system is open enough, so if you have nice new algorithm you want to try out, get the thing and play with it. The next one. So playing with it, when I just mentioned it, is just an example of things we did here. There are, of course, all different kinds of analysis you can do. And in this case, as for the method of quantification, in this example, it is essential to point out that there is a distinction between the observed amount and the statistically expected amount on the site, assuming the Samian had some kind of normative distribution. And the method used to calculate the proximity of Samian supplies between two specific sites is, of course, always a function of quantity and distance. In this case, we use also the network density value, or we call the threshold value of the connection between two sites. In this case, we divide the sum of both expected values by the distances in kilometers. So if the number of plots in London is greater than the expected value, the dot on the map produced by the network analysis program will be colored red, and the blue lines between the two sites will be drawn blue, and the sites not fulfilling the statistical requirement are displayed in gray dots. Just, I think, yes, so the calculation method, I do a post in the chat. You can find it there. It's just a bunch of confusion code. So it's always the same thing, like the old days of statistical analysis with dendrograms. It depends on the parameters you set around it. What kind of result do you want? There is no objective one solid result. In this case, what does impress me is that it gives a suggestion that the Samian, in this case of London, and the Scottish military, but also the civil sites like York, are apparently traded in sort of hub-like structures. And starting from the huge hub in London, there are sort of sub-hubs visible. So what we actually wanted to show is that it's not chain-like structure. So there were no wagons driving along all the sites and selling off their wagons empty. Well, this is only one kind of analysis you can do. We did with it, and Erik has more.
Thanks, Allard. So yeah, this is kind of the data set that's available, and that may give you a couple of ideas of what to do with it. Actually, what we did with it is based on the idea that our impression was this is the first time in economics, at least, and historical economics, that one can connect origin and destination. And this is done, if it hasn't become clear, from Allard's outline, because of the fact that each of these Samian vessels, each of this ceramic, included a stamp done by the producer. So we have these production sites across Europe where these vessels are produced, that we see here on the right hand side once more. And these are large kiln sites where these ceramics are burned. And since there are multiple potters at these kiln sites, they wanted to distinguish their individual batches from each other. And this is why they put a stamp on their vessels in order to figure out that this is their batch. And this then allows us to kind of trace the trade patterns, because basically the find sites, the archaeological find sites that we have on the left-hand side here, we interpret them as their destination. This is where they end up being traded to. And then the production sites are the origins. And this is kind of the only time allowing us to connect origin and destination in such an analysis. And that makes it very special, and allows us to think about the ways in which these goods traveled. And this is basically showing us origin and destination. So this would be the flows of Terra Sigillata. kind of connecting with specific colors the origin, the production site with their eventual destination, where archaeologists dug up these potsherds. So next step is the network. So how do we connect data with the network? So we created for the region of interest. So this is not the entire Roman Empire, obviously. We kind of focus on Western Europe, largely because of data constraints on the Terra Sigillata side, but also on the contemporary modern data. So this is kind of the focus, geographical focus of our analysis. And you see that we have different modes of transportation that were available to the merchants in Roman times. So we have 3 modes of transportation that we focus on. One is roads, the well-known Roman roads. Second is rivers, and the third one is sea travel. So these are the 3 modes of transportation that we allowed, and that creates an integrated network with different transportation modes. And then we calculate between any region in this data set, and I'm going to tell you later what a region is, and a measure of effective distance, which is a least cost path between these regions. And the least cost path has 2 aspects, namely it has a length, and we kind of, each segment of this network has its own length. It's basically measured in kilometers. And the second aspect is a transport cost. So we weigh each length, if you want, by their transport costs, and these transport costs are Roman specific. And so what we do is we go to look at what Walter Scheidel did with Diocletian's edict. That's an edict of maximum prices published in the year 301 Common Era. And we don't care about absolute prices. They might be not very informative, but relative prices have been deemed to seem relatively valid. And if we use relative price, it means we normalize the most the cheapest mode of transport to one, that would be sea travel. And then we know river travel is 7.5 times as costly as sea travel. And the most costly mode of transportation is road travel, which has been calculated to be 52 times as costly as sea travel. Just note that the river travel that we use is an average of downstream and upstream river travel. We can use also a directed network and use the value 5 and 10. We do that in robustness checks, and it doesn't make a huge difference in the results. So the intuition is that if I'm a merchant in Roman times, I can use the full network to travel between regions I and J, and I will pick the route that is the least costly to me from all the available routes. And so if these relative transport costs are somehow relevant, we will see that the least cost routes that we calculate is important for the volume of trade that we observe. To give you an idea of what these least cost paths are, let me show you this map of different least cost paths that we could look at. So this is an example of the connection between Turin and Dijon. You see, maybe let's start with the geographic distance. That's kind of standard thing to look at. This would be the distance as the crow flies. This is the dashed black line. So this would be, obviously, you cannot travel that, but this is certainly a measure of distance that we're all aware of. And then we have different least cost paths that we calculate. The red one is actually the one that we're interested in. This is the least cost path based on transport costs. So if you want to minimize transport costs, we would take the route, a bit of road down from Turin to the Mediterranean. We go to Genoa, from there take the ship across the Mediterranean, where we enter just beyond Marseille into the Rhône. We take river transport up to Lyon, where we enter the Saône, and then go up to almost about Dijon, where we take a bit of road again. So in our network, it will be always super cheap to take the sea travel route, and agents will always prefer to kind of try and go to the sea in order to get to their destination and avoid roads a bit. The alternative would be a distance-wise shortest path in the network. That would be our blue line here. So if we just wanted to minimize distance within an existing network, we would take mostly roads because it will always be the shortest route. If we go time-wise, then it's probably relatively similar, even though we have different speeds of the different transport modes. In this situation, it would still be the quickest to take mostly road with a bit of lake travel on the Lake Geneva here. So that would be the time-wise shortest path C in the network. And we can later on compare which best explains our trade patterns and data. We also have this human mobility index here. This is the green line. I don't want to dwell too much on this for the sake of time, and try to continue to get you at least one result with what we're doing here. So the data set that we're creating, and this is basically important for the unit of analysis, is, let me show you this map. So we're cutting down Europe in grid cells for the pure fact that we don't have good regions to compare. We're kind of cutting down Europe in 55 times 50 times kilometer grid cells. This is 0.5 times 0.5 degree size. And for each of these grid cells, we calculate distance to each other grid cell that is connected to the network. So all gray cells are connected to the network, and we can calculate a bilateral measure of effective distance. So that's the least cost path between any of those. And that creates a matrix of 903 times 903 grid cell pairs. So we're going to be interested in each of these pairs. How much is their effective distance and how much do they trade with each other? And for the purpose of trade measures, we kind of aggregate up all the terra sigillata finds within a grid cell and see if grid cell pairs that have a lower effective distance trade more with each other than grid cells that are further apart according to their least cost path. That's the idea, right? So that basically brings me already to the first results. If there's no questions about this, I'm going to show you an estimating equation. I don't know if you care about as much as economists about that. I'm going to do it anyway. So we basically, what we're doing is estimating the account model. So it's a Poisson distribution model that estimates a maximum likelihood distribution, where we have an outcome Hij, which is basically a measure of how much potsherds we find in a grid cell I that was produced in another grid cell J, and that these are these production centers. So we have, as Allard showed, we have roughly 60 production centers within Europe, and these can send out terra sigillata anywhere in Europe. And we want to understand whether they send it out on the least cost path. And this is why we regress this measure of trade volumes on this least cost path distance. And then empirically, we're going to control for a couple of things, including geographic distance. So not that we capture just geographic distance. This is not what we want. We're going to control for a couple of other geographic factors that distinguish these grid cells I and J. But what's most important, at least from a empirical perspective in a trade model, is that we have origin and destination fixed effects. Why should we care about that? Because it's clear that certain places are different than others, right? So many factors could explain why some regions attract more terra sigillata. Could be that this is London, it's a major hub, right? Obviously, we will find more terra sigillata potsherds from any production center. And this is not what we want to measure, right? So here's kind of one example. Consider two destinations, Dijon and Bourg. Dijon is larger than Bourges. therefore attracts more ceramics. However, Dijon receives more ceramics from all regions, as I said, so that the level will be higher for all the production centers. And this is what we're going to capture with a fixed effect. So basically, we kind of subtract the mean number of potsherds that are sent from any production center. This is basically an intercept that we add that is different for any combination of these grid cells in a pair. And so after including this destination fixed effect, we only compare within trade partners of Dijon and see if closer trade partners in the effective distance measure send more pots to Dijon. And at the same time, we do the same thing with origins. Obviously, we have production sites that are much larger, like La Grove-5 is the most important production site, much larger than, for example, Trier, which is just a minor production site in our data set. And so it's clear that Trier is sending less ceramics to any destination. And since we don't want to measure that, we also have a different intercept for all the trading partners with Trier. So kind of tracing out these fixed effects and different means with any destinations for Trier. This also takes account of the fact that there might be excavation bias. So there's places where you kind of, in England, you will be more interested in Roman history maybe than in Spain. And there's just more digging going on. And you will be finding more ceramics, obviously, because of the fact. And this excavation bias will also be captured by our fixed effect because it will be true for any origin production site. Which brings me to kind of our main table, just to kind of give you the flavor of what we're doing here. What we're basically estimating is this elasticity, where the dependent variable is, we actually were forced to use the share of terra sigliata find from a production site. The same would be true for a count. This is just kind of technical difficulty that we had. The share of terra sigliata find in grid cell I that is derived from production site J should be larger the further it is, the closer it is by, right? So if effective distance is higher, then we should find less of these potsherds in a given cell. And this is what we find. So here we find a significant difference in places that are further away than closer by, based on our least cost path, right? And this is the elasticity that I talked about when starting this talk. So here we estimated at 2 roughly. So for each percentage increase in the distance, we have a reduction in trade by 2%. And this is conditional on a couple of things, including when we actually control for geographic distance, which makes grid cell pairs that are in equal distance to each other similar and only compares those two, then it's still the fact that those connected via the trade network better according to the trade costs are trading more. It's not affected by the network distance. So these were the blue line that I showed you earlier, or the network time. And so our main measure of trade connectivity is significantly explaining trade patterns in the Roman Empire. And that's basically, I guess this is all my time, all the time I had. So I'm happy to conclude real quick. So the paper that we are about to publish was concerned with path dependence mostly and economic integration between regions in the very long run. For that, we showed, first of all, that the Roman specific transport costs affect trade in the Roman Empire. And then later we show that it also affects the intensity of bilateral ownership links, so business links today. And we have a couple of mechanisms that we traced out that I wasn't able to talk about, including persistent connectivity patterns based on selective infrastructure routing, and there's evidence on integration based on values and preferences that become more similar for places that are better connected using Roman connectivity patterns. Thanks a lot for attending, and I'm looking forward to discussing this with you.